The hidden traps. Understanding why we fall into temptation. Have you ever found yourself making a promise you were absolutely certain you would keep, only to break it days or even hours later? That moment when you swore you wouldn't indulge in that extra dessert, wouldn't check your ex's social media profile, wouldn't procrastinate on that important project. Yet somehow, despite your best intentions, you did exactly what you promised yourself you wouldn't do. If this sounds familiar, you're experiencing one of the most fundamental aspects of human nature, the struggle with temptation. Today, we're going to uncover the hidden factors that repeatedly lead us into temptation's grasp, often without us even realizing what's happening. Understanding these triggers isn't just fascinating. It's the first essential step toward breaking free from cycles that keep us trapped in behaviors we genuinely want to change. By the end of our journey together, you'll have a clear roadmap for recognizing and overcoming the specific factors that have been undermining your best intentions. The truth is, willpower alone is rarely enough. If it were, we'd all be living our ideal lives, free from the habits and impulses that pull us away from our better judgment. Instead, we need something more powerful. Awareness of the specific circumstances, emotional states, and thought patterns that make us vulnerable to temptation in the first place. Let's begin by understanding the first major factor: environmental triggers. Our surroundings influence our behavior far more than most of us realize. Research in behavioral psychology has consistently shown that our environment can override our conscious intentions, activating automatic responses that bypass our rational decision-making entirely. Consider how difficult it is to resist checking your phone when you hear a notification sound, even in the middle of an important conversation, or how challenging it becomes to maintain a healthy diet when surrounded by easily accessible junk food. These aren't failures of character. They're predictable responses to environmental cues designed specifically to trigger desire. The most successful people don't just rely on willpower to resist these triggers. They strategically redesign their environments to support their goals, rather than undermine them. They recognize that the path of least resistance usually determines our behavior, so they make temptation difficult and positive choices easier. Look around your own environment. What objects, sounds, or situations consistently lead you toward behaviors you're trying to change? The first step in overcoming temptation isn't building more willpower. It's becoming aware of and modifying these environmental triggers that bypass your conscious control. The second factor that leads us into temptation is emotional vulnerability. When we're stressed, lonely, bored, angry, or even just tired, our resistance to temptation dramatically decreases. This explains why that diet is easy to maintain until a stressful day at work sends you straight to comfort food, or why your commitment to productivity collapses when you're feeling emotionally drained. Emotions create a state of narrowed attention, where immediate relief becomes far more compelling than long-term goals. In these moments, the brain's reward system essentially hijacks our decision-making process, prioritizing immediate comfort over future benefits. What makes this factor particularly challenging is that many of our most destructive temptations actually work, at least in the short term. That impulse purchase really does momentarily lift your mood. That extra glass of wine really does temporarily reduce your anxiety. That mindless scrolling really does briefly distract you from uncomfortable emotions. The key insight here isn't to suppress these emotions. That strategy almost always backfires. Instead, it's developing emotional awareness and alternative coping strategies. When you can recognize, I'm not actually hungry, I'm bored, or I don't actually need to check social media, I'm feeling lonely. You create space to choose a response that addresses the real need, rather than falling into a familiar but unhelpful pattern. The third factor pulling us into temptation is what psychologists call cognitive distortions. The ways our minds trick us into justifying choices we know aren't aligned with our deeper values. These mental shortcuts are particularly dangerous because they make us complicit in our own deception. One common distortion is the "what the hell" effect. The thought process that goes, I've already broken my diet with this cookie, so what the hell, I might as well eat the entire box. Another is future discounting. Our tendency to prioritize immediate rewards over future benefits, even when those future benefits are objectively more valuable. Perhaps the most insidious distortion is permission-giving thoughts. Those seemingly reasonable justifications that pop into our minds precisely when we're facing temptation. I deserve this after the day I've had. Or, just this once won't hurt. Or, I'll start fresh tomorrow. These thoughts are so effective because they contain elements of truth, making them difficult to counter in the moment. Becoming aware of your specific permission-giving thoughts is crucial. When you can recognize these thoughts as they arise, you can prepare counter-arguments in advance, making you far less likely to be persuaded by them when your defenses are down. The fourth factor leading us into temptation is identity conflict. When our behavior conflicts with our self-image, we experience what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a state of mental discomfort that we're motivated to resolve. Ideally, we resolve this dissonance by changing our behavior to match our values. But often, especially with persistent temptations, we instead modify our self-image or beliefs to accommodate the behavior. This explains why someone who sees themselves as health-conscious might start believing that certain unhealthy foods are not that bad, rather than acknowledging the contradiction between their actions and identity. Or why someone who values honesty might develop elaborate justifications for small deceptions rather than confronting their behavior directly. The most effective approach to addressing identity conflict isn't shame or self-criticism. It's clarifying and strengthening your core identity around the values that matter most to you. When you deeply identify with being the kind of person who keeps promises to yourself, resisting temptation becomes less about deprivation and more about maintaining integrity with who you truly are. The fifth factor, and one that's often overlooked, is social influence. Humans are fundamentally social creatures, and our desire to belong can override almost any other motivation we have. This explains why our behavior so often shifts to match the people around us, even when it contradicts our stated intentions. Research consistently shows that we're more likely to engage in behaviors we see others performing, especially people we identify with or admire. If everyone in your social circle spends frivolously, maintains unhealthy habits, or engages in gossip, you'll likely find yourself pulled toward these behaviors regardless of your personal values. This influence operates through multiple channels. Sometimes it's direct peer pressure, but more often it's subtle normalization, the unstated assumption that certain behaviors are simply what people do. The most powerful social influence comes from our desire to belong and be accepted within our chosen groups. The solution isn't necessarily changing your entire social circle, though sometimes that becomes necessary. More often, it's becoming consciously aware of these influences and deliberately seeking out communities that support your aspirations rather than undermine them. Who we surround ourselves with quite literally shapes who we become. The sixth factor leading us into temptation is depletion of mental resources. Willpower, contrary to popular belief, isn't an unlimited resource. It's more like a muscle that fatigues with use. This explains why our ability to resist temptation often decreases throughout the day, and why we're more vulnerable after periods of intense focus, difficult decisions, or emotional strain. This depletion effect helps explain patterns that might otherwise seem like moral failings. The executive who maintains perfect composure through a day of high-stakes meetings, then loses control with family at home, isn't necessarily being hypocritical. They're experiencing the natural consequences of willpower depletion. Understanding this factor shifts our approach from simply trying harder to strategically managing our mental energy. This might mean scheduling important decisions when your willpower is highest, building recovery periods into your day, or using techniques like pre-commitment, making decisions in advance when you're in a clear-headed state, rather than in the moment when temptation is strong. The seventh and final factor is perhaps the most fundamental: unmet needs. At the core of many persistent temptations are legitimate human needs that aren't being adequately addressed. When these deeper needs go unrecognized or unmet, we often turn to substitute satisfactions that provide temporary relief, but never truly resolve the underlying hunger. For instance, excessive social media use might be attempting to meet a legitimate need for connection. Compulsive shopping might be trying to fulfill a need for security or self-expression. Understanding what legitimate need your temptation is attempting to satisfy can transform how you approach it. Instead of focusing exclusively on resisting the temptation, this perspective invites you to ask, what am I really seeking here? And what would a more direct, fulfilling way to meet this need look like? This shifts your energy from fighting against something to moving towards something better, a much more sustainable approach in the long run. As we've explored these 7 factors, environmental triggers, emotional vulnerability, cognitive distortions, identity conflicts, social influences, mental depletion, and unmet needs, You may have recognized patterns in your own experience with temptation. This recognition isn't cause for discouragement, but for hope. What can be understood can be changed. The path forward isn't about achieving perfect self-control or eliminating temptation entirely. Neither is realistic or even desirable. Instead, it's about developing a more sophisticated understanding of how temptation operates in your specific life and creating systems that support your deeper intentions. Start by focusing on awareness rather than control. For 1 week, simply observe when temptation arises without immediately trying to fight it. Notice which of these 7 factors are most relevant in your experience. Is it primarily your environment triggering automatic responses? Is it emotional vulnerability at certain times of day? Is it specific thought patterns that give you permission to indulge? This awareness alone will begin to shift your relationship with temptation. What previously felt like mysterious failures of willpower will start to reveal themselves as predictable patterns with specific causes. And what has specific causes can have specific solutions. Remember that occasional yielding to temptation doesn't define your character. It's part of the universal human experience. What defines us is not the absence of temptation, but how we respond to it over time, how we learn from each experience, and how we gradually align our choices with our deepest values. The journey toward mastering temptation isn't linear. There will be setbacks and discoveries, moments of breakthrough, and moments of frustration. But with each cycle, you gain deeper insight into yourself and greater skill in navigating these challenges. In time, you may find that what once required constant vigilance becomes more natural. The environmental changes you make become your new normal. The emotional awareness you develop becomes instinctive. The cognitive distortions lose their power when exposed to the light of conscious attention. The greatest victory over temptation isn't never feeling it. It's building a life where the deepest satisfactions come from choices aligned with your authentic self, making momentary temptations less compelling by comparison. It's creating a life where what you want most consistently outweighs what you want now. This journey of understanding and overcoming the factors that lead you into temptation isn't just about avoiding negative behaviors. It's about creating space for something better to emerge. It's about freedom. The freedom to choose your path rather than being driven by unconscious forces. It's about integrity, the profound satisfaction of living in alignment with your deepest values. And ultimately, it's about fulfillment, discovering that the lasting joy of authentic living far outweighs the fleeting pleasure of momentary indulgence. The question now is not whether you'll face temptation. You will. The question is whether you'll face it unconsciously, repeating familiar patterns, or with clear awareness and effective strategies. The power to choose is yours, and in that choice lies the possibility of transformation.